Queen's Own Rifles, quick march! That is the rousing, spirited regimental march at 140 paces to the minute that has announced the arrival of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada for 140 years. Proud to be Canada's oldest continuous serving regiment. The unique double past at 160 paces to the minute and the distinctive dark green uniforms distinguish members of the Queen's Own as a rifle regiment and links its members in tradition and history. Throughout the history of Canada, the Queen's Own has responded in times of civil and international crisis. Today, as part of the militia, it remains true to its motto, in paces paratus, in peace prepared, ready to meet any challenge.
The importance of the militia today to both Canada and, of course, Canadians is the ability to expand to meet any national emergency and to fulfill any roles or tasks that might be given to them by either the government of Canada or the regular force.
As history shows, it is a familiar role for the Queen's Own Rifles. Formed on April 26, 1860, the regiment was born while Canada was growing from provincehood to nationhood, a time when the country needed an organized military force to replace departing British troops.
The British government had decided that Canada should contribute more to its own defense after the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny, and as a result pressured the local provincial governments to form an active militia to defend the country.
Independent volunteer companies had been around since 1856, formed after the Militia Act of 1855. In 1860, the companies around Toronto combined to form the 2nd Battalion Volunteer Militia Rifles of Canada.
It also came to serve as a sense of national awareness, ultimately, especially after the Fenian raids in 1866. Canadians, instead of thinking of themselves as Canada East or Canada West, became Canadians. And they developed a patriotism and a larger sense of nationhood, in fact, as a result of their service.
The design of the original cap badge, bearing the number 2, signifying the 2nd Battalion, over the maple leaf, is still worn today. Lieutenant Colonel William Smith Drury, a graduate of the Royal Military College Sandhurst, was the first commanding officer. In 1863, the regiment underwent its first name change to become the Queen's Own Rifles of Toronto. From the earliest days, the band and bugles have been a part of the regiment. The buglers originally relayed orders to the pioneers, skirmishers, and riflemen, who were usually scattered in the field.
The bugles are servicemen who were used for signals and passing signals from the commander down to his troops. And the band was used for entertainment and lightening the march and adding stirring music to ceremonial occasions. In rifle regiments, they combine on parade, and they offer a unique and different type of music than found in regular line regiments or Highland regiments. Combined brass and bugles is quite stirring.
The first test of the regiment came in 1866. A group of Irish independence fighters, made up mostly of discharged U.S. Civil War soldiers, known as Fenians, crossed the Niagara River from the United States near Fort Erie. They wanted to embarrass the English by invading Canada. Instead, they were met by a Canadian force, including the Queen's Own Rifles at Ridgeway. After a seesaw battle in which 7 members of the Queen's Own Rifles were killed and 21 wounded, the Fenians pulled back and returned to the United States. Canada's sovereignty had been defended. When Canada was born as a nation on July the 1st, 1867, the Queen's Own Rifles celebrated with a renewed sense of patriotism, little knowing it would soon be called upon again to defend the fledgling Dominion. In the West, the Red River Rebellion was brewing. The Métis, led by Louis Riel, were angered over the transfer of the Northwest Territories to the Dominion of Canada. They seized Fort Garry in 1870. When they executed a British loyalist, the government was forced to take action. The Queen's Own Rifles were brigaded with a British Rifle Corps and set out to quell the uprising. Together, they endured a punishing 13-week trip which included 47 demanding portages through the black fly and mosquito-infested wilderness. They reached Fort Garry at the end of August. When they arrived, there was no bloodshed. Riel and his followers fled across the border to the United States. Peace was restored, and Manitoba was granted provincehood that same year. In the mid-1870s, the militia was called out to aid civil power. 3 regiments, including the Queen's Own, helped police control the so-called pilgrimage riots between Orangemen and Catholics in the streets of Toronto in 1875. 2 years later, the mayor of Belleville requested help to subdue riots by laid-off railway workers. A detachment of Queen's Own beat off 2 mob attacks and protected the trains until the company and workers settled their differences. In 1881, the regiment created, trained, and equipped Canada's first ambulance corps. A year later, its name was changed from the Queen's Own Rifles of Toronto to the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. In 1885, 14 years after the original uprising, the Prairie Métis called on the exiled Louis Riel to lead a rebellion. And once again, the Queen's Own Rifles headed west. The weather was bitterly cold, but the journey was eased this time by the existence of a partly constructed railway. The Canadian Pacific Railway provided flatbed cars and food for the soldiers. It also supplied horse-drawn sleighs to cover the 4 incomplete sections of the rail line to Winnipeg. A few weeks later, the Queen's Own, under Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Otter, faced Chief Poundmaker, one of Riel's allies at Cut Knife Creek. After a full day of heavy fighting, the troops retired. Although not victorious, Otter was hailed for his tactical ability. The Métis won their final victory at Fish Creek. It became clear the Canadian troops would not give up. At Batoche, the tables were turned. The rebels were defeated and disarmed. Riel surrendered a few weeks later, and the regiment returned home. When Britain became involved in the Boer War in 1899, a Canadian unit, including volunteers from the Queen's Own Rifles, was sent to South Africa. Officers in the field praised them as being among the most gallant troops in the world. By 1906, the regiment was so strong it was divided into 2 battalions under Colonel Sir Henry Mill Pellet. Pellet was a generous supporter of the regiment, and the man best known for building Toronto's famous Casa Loma. For the regiment's 50th birthday in 1910, Sir Henry planned a number of extravagant events, including a reunion and historical pageant. The high point was a trip to England by the battalion, at Sir Henry Pellet's expense. When Canada joined Britain against the Germans in World War I, the regiment was prepared. 210 officers and 7,352 men were immediately sent overseas. As casualties mounted, the regiment continued to recruit and train men. The Queen's Own Rifles made up most of the 3rd Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force. The regiment received 21 battle honors, including Vimy Ridge, Ypres, and the Somme. By the end of 4 miserable years of trench warfare, 181 officers and 4,592 other ranks had been lost in action. Drained by the human and financial costs of the war, the public and the government withdrew support from the militia. While recruitment and funding dropped, internal morale never wavered. On July 27, 1928, Her Majesty Queen Mary became Colonel-in-Chief of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, a position she held for 25 years. Every regiment has a spiritual home. For the Queen's Own Rifles, it is St. Paul's Anglican Church in Toronto. The Cross of Sacrifice, erected in 1931, commemorates those who died in wars. Inside, the Book of Remembrance records the name of all who lost their lives from the Fenian raids to Korea. "1939 was a historic year for the regiment. His Majesty King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Toronto. The Queen's Own Rifles performed ceremonial duties, including supplying the Guard of Honor for the royal couple's departure from Union Station. Celebration turned to sorrow the same year. The regiment mourned the loss of the legendary Sir Henry Pellet, a lifelong supporter and benefactor, and the year sadly marked an end to peace. 10 days after Adolf Hitler's army invaded Poland, Canada, as a sovereign nation, declared war on Germany. The Queen's Own was mobilized on May the 24th, 1940. The battalion spent its first 6 months in Newfoundland protecting the airport at Gander and providing internal security. Members of the regiment arrived in Britain in July of 1941 and were stationed at Aldershot for training. In September, the troops were reviewed by their Colonel-in-Chief, Queen Mary. In 1944, Commanding Officer Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Jock Sprague welcomed the Honorable Vincent Massey, High Commissioner for Canada and former member of the Queen's Own. Later the same year, Sprague was promoted to brigadier, and Lieutenant Colonel Steve Lett succeeded him as commanding officer. In 1943, training for the invasion of Europe began in earnest. By June 1944, rehearsal turned into reality. D-Day had finally come. As the soldiers prepared to cross the English Channel, they had a sense of the historic role they were about to play, but little fear.
We were kids, and kids don't get afraid. They don't become frightened. We were invincible. We were invincible in our minds.
The crossing that day was rough, and many were seasick. As they approached the French coast, they could hear the dull thud of distant bombing. After a delay of what felt like a lifetime, the men were commanded to go in. A Company, under Major Elliot Dalton, went to the right. B Company, under his brother, Major Charles Dalton, landed to the left. 50 years later, Colonel Charles Dalton would remember the commitment of the Canadian troops.
We were the only army that was all volunteers, was the Canadian Army. Everybody else was a conscripted army. But everybody we had was there because he wanted to be there.
Casualties were heavy in the dash up the beach.
I remember about 3/4 of the way up to the wall, I finally sneaked to look back, and there were a whole line of people lying on the beach. And my first thought was, they've gone to ground. They didn't follow me. And then I realized that they hadn't gone to ground, they were casualties, and that these machine guns, which were still firing, were shooting at the ones that were lying there wounded and dead, and those they hadn't killed in the first breath, they were killing then.
The Queen's Own Rifles was one of only a few units to land in the initial D-Day assault. The objective that day was achieved, but at a terrible cost. Sergeant Major Charles Martin recalled that day on a return visit to Berny-sur-Mer in 1994.
You just couldn't realize, it was unbelievable that 24 hours before, these men were just 20, 23-year-old men, and suddenly here we had on the beach over 40 or 50 men dead, and 50 casualties, more than that. It was hard to believe when the 5 of us had made it right to the end of the village, and then the rest of the platoons moved up. But it was so emotional, it's hard to explain, because you just broke down and cried.
The foothold in Normandy was secured, and the British and Canadians moved south toward the French town of Caen. Throughout June, the Canadians made slow but sure progress. On July 3rd, members of the Queen's Own Rifles advanced on the airport at Carpiquet, a strategic airfield. The troops endured 5 days of fierce fighting before Carpiquet was taken. Meanwhile, Montgomery launched a full assault on Caen, where he hoped to attract the bulk of the German force. On July 10th, the town was cleared. The Germans withdrew. The next month was spent fighting along the bloody road to Falaise. By the time the push ended, the German 7th Army was virtually destroyed. The Germans were now in full flight, and the Canadians pushed through northern France and into Belgium, freeing the crucial Channel ports. While moving through the Rhineland in February 1945, there occurred a unique display of courage. A young sergeant named Aubrey Cousins led an attack on a farmhouse building in a German-occupied hamlet named Mooshoff. His platoon commander dead, Cousins ordered a tank from the 1st Hussars to ram one of the buildings. As one Hussar trooper recollected 20 years later,
although we wanted to perhaps put grenades in there, not take a chance, Cousins talked us out of it, exposed himself in the doorway, and by talking and yelling to the Germans inside was able to gain their confidence into coming out and being taken.
Moments later, Cousins was killed by a sniper. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The tide had turned in favor of the Allies. Members of the Queen's Own Rifles were near Ostersander, Germany, on the morning of May 5th, 1945, when the official ceasefire was ordered. Brigadier Jock Spragg received his DSO from His Majesty King George VI on the Western Front. By the end of the war, 873 members of the Queen's Own had been wounded, 393 died. They fought with selfless courage and endured incredible hardships. They sacrificed their youth, innocence, and vitality. Some paid with their lives. They did it for the simplest of reasons, so that future generations could live in freedom and peace. And for that, we will remember them. After the intensity of World War II, life at home and in the regiment slowed down. Her Majesty Queen Mary, the regiment's colonel-in-chief for 25 years, died on March 24th, 1953. Her Royal Highness, Princess Alexandra of Kent, took over as colonel-in-chief in 1960. One of the first tastes of unification came in 1953 with the formation of the 27th Brigade to honor Canada's NATO commitments. Contributions from the Reserve Rifle Regiments of Canada formed the Permanent Force Rifle Regiment, which was then rebadged as the 1st and 2nd Battalions, Queen's Own Rifles. Reserve Battalion in Toronto was the 3rd Battalion. The depot was activated in 1954 in Edmonton. It was moved to Currie Barracks in Calgary the following year. Thousands of men completed training in the depot. They were given the basics of military drill, weapon training, and regimental history. In October 1954, a deadly storm struck the city of Toronto. Hurricane Hazel killed 83 people and left hundreds homeless. It caused massive destruction and flooding. The Queen's Own Rifles responded to the emergency, helping with rescue and reconstruction. After the Korean War, the 2nd Battalion was selected for duty along the line between North and South Korea. When the Canadian force was reduced the following year, the Queen's Own was chosen as the 1 Battalion to stay. In 1960, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada celebrated its 100th birthday. Events included a wreath-laying ceremony at Toronto City Hall by Mayor Phillips, a glamorous rifles ball, and a church parade at St. Paul's with a salute taken by Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery. Her Royal Highness Princess Alexandra of Kent honored her regiment with a birthday visit to Fort Macleod in Germany. The regiment presented the great-granddaughter of Queen Mary with a diamond regimental pin. In the early 1960s, Cold War anxiety shifted the regiment's focus from military readiness to national survival training. Soldiers learned civil defense skills, crowd control, and emergency evacuation procedures. In 1963, the Queen's Own marked the end of an era when the University Avenue armories were torn down. The regiment sadly left its longtime home for a brief stay at the Richmond Street Armories, then moved to its current home at Moss Park Armories. Most of the NCOs and officers of the Queen's Own at the time had seen service in World War II or Korea. They enriched the regiment with their knowledge and experience, which they generously shared with all ranks. To attract young men into the militia, the Student Militia Program was established. Each regiment was allowed to recruit and train 35 to 40 high school students in a 5-week program. As the decade closed, the need for 3 battalions and a depot was reduced. By 1970, the 1st and 2nd battalions and depot were deactivated. Concentrated in Toronto, the regiment lived up to its motto.
If we look at the motto of the Queen's Own Rifles in Pace Paratus, which translated means in peace prepared, I think that is the key to the rationale and the raison d'etre for the Queen's Own Rifles. They have been called upon in almost every wartime emergency to either provide support for a regular force or, in fact, full battalions.
The Queen's Own Rifles has served Canada with the same well-trained proficiency in peace as in war. The term peacekeeper has become almost synonymous with Canada. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson initiated the idea of a neutral international force under the United Nations to act as a buffer between combatants. Members of the Queen's Own have served in almost every peacekeeping situation, including Cyprus, Sinai, and the former Yugoslavia. In 1983, the Queen's Own received an operational tasking to provide an airborne platoon to support 3 Commando of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. After the Airborne Regiment was disbanded, Queen's Own jumpers were allied with 3 RCR and continued to support the Canadian Parachute Centre in Trenton. Militia training today prepares members to serve in any kind of an emergency.
We do, in fact, need an army, and in my opinion, they need a strong reserve army. There are so many tasks that we may be called upon to do, and I'm not just talking wartime. I think Mother Nature has already proven in the last 3 or 4 years that she plays quite a hand in upsetting the economy of the country.
Members of the Queen's Own Rifles take pride in their long history and the traditions that distinguish them as a rifle regiment. Some of the unique characteristics include the display of battle honors. Rifle regiments do not carry colors. The battle honors are emblazoned on the drums. Riflemen march in quick time. They are often referred to as the cavalry on foot. And they carry their rifles at the trail, ready for quick use. The famous Green Jackets, a name often used for rifle regiments, was originally one of the earliest forms of camouflage. In the field, the infantry preferred to blend in with its surroundings rather than be an identifiable target in a scarlet jacket. Members of the Queen's Own who sacrificed their lives for Canada are honored every Remembrance Day. Anniversaries such as D-Day hold special meaning for veterans and members of the Queen's Own. 50 years after the assault on Normandy, a contingent of Queen's Own returned to the beaches. Time had changed the landscape, but not the memories of that bloody day. Those who returned remembered their lost friends and shared their thoughts with those lucky enough never to have experienced war. Today, the Queen's Own Rifles has a new role to play.
The Canadian economy, the way it is today, just cannot afford a large full-time standing army. And I think in order to be able to meet our commitments in NATO and around the world, and notwithstanding the commitments we have within our own country, that it is necessary and vital that we have a strong reserve force. It's a part-time force, and it's important that they be well-trained and supported by the regular force, but it still must be large enough to be able to expand in any emergency.
Meeting an emergency is just what the militia did during the ice storm in January of 1998, which crippled parts of Ontario and Quebec. Close to 1.4 million people were out of power. "3,000 reservists were called out to use their military expertise to help stranded residents.
really wells you up inside. It really does. They came when we needed them.
It is hard to know what the future holds for the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. But if the last 140 years are any indication of its ability to remain prepared, reliable, and adaptable, it will prevail.
In its 200th year, they'll still be Canada's oldest and finest continuous infantry regiment.